I still go up there sometimes, in my head. Not the tower itself, I mean the stairs. 84 of them, steel, painted gray, bolted into the side of a mountain in the middle of nowhere. I climbed those stairs every evening for 11 weeks. I could probably still tell you which steps creaked and which ones didn't, which ones had ice on them even in October, which one had a loose bolt that rang like a tuning fork if you stepped on the edge of it. I don't work there anymore. I want to say that up front, because I know how these things sound, and I don't want anyone thinking I'm still up there, scared, hiding behind some story. I'm not hiding. I'm just telling you what happened, as plainly as I can, because somebody else might take that job next season, and I think they should know what they're agreeing to before they sign the contract. When I first read the rules taped inside the radio cabinet, I thought they were a joke. A hazing thing. Something the seasonal guys did to scare each other, like camp counselors telling ghost stories to the new kids. That was my first mistake. Not believing the rules. I mean not taking them seriously enough, fast enough. I was 34 when I took the position. I'd been a high school shop teacher for 9 years before the school district cut the program, and after that I did some substitute work, some contracting, nothing that stuck. My marriage had ended about a year before, not dramatically, just slowly, the way a tire goes flat. You don't notice until you're driving on the rim. I had some savings, no kids, and a truck that still ran. What I wanted, more than anything, was to not have to talk to people for a while. A guy I knew from a hardware store mentioned that the Forest Service was short-staffed for fire lookout positions that season, especially the remote ones nobody wanted. Most lookouts are seasonal and daytime. You watch for smoke, you call it in, you go home at night. But this one, Lower Saddle Tower, had been converted a few years back to run a night shift as well, because of some staffing change with the district that nobody ever explained to me clearly. 2 people split the 24 hours. A guy named Hollis Pruitt had the day shift and had been doing it, on and off, for almost 30 years. I'd take the night. Pay wasn't great. Housing was a single-wide trailer about half a mile down the access road, no internet, spotty generator power, propane heat. My truck was the only way in or out, and the access road washed out completely if it rained more than an inch, which in that part of the country it did, often. I didn't care. That was the whole point. Hollis met me on my first day. He was somewhere around 70, lean in the way that old ranchers and lifelong outdoorsmen get lean, with hands that looked like they'd been left out in weather for 50 years. He didn't say much. He showed me the trailer, showed me where the propane shutoff was, showed me the truck route up to the tower, and then he took me up the 84 stairs and showed me the cab. The cab itself was about 14 feet square, glass on all 4 sides, a steel catwalk running around the outside about 3 feet wide. Inside there was a cot, a small table, a wood stove that I was told never to use after dark. That part wasn't in the rules. That was just because the chimney pipe had a crack in it, and Hollis didn't trust it. A logbook, a set of binoculars, an old Osborne fire finder in the center of the room like a big brass compass table, and the radio. The radio was the important thing. It was an old base unit, bolted to the wall under the north-facing window, with a separate handset on a coiled cord. Above it, someone had taped a laminated index card, yellowed at the edges, with 7 rules typed on it in a font I didn't recognize, like it had come off a real typewriter. "You're gonna want to read those," Hollis said. "And I mean really read them. Not skim." I laughed a little. I thought he was setting up some kind of joke. He didn't laugh back. He just looked at me for a second, longer than was comfortable, and then he said, "I'll go over them with you tonight before I head down. After that, they're yours to keep." That evening, after he'd shown me the rest of the routine, how to log smoke sightings, how to use the fire finder to triangulate a bearing, how to do the hourly weather observations. Hollis sat down across from me at the little table and pulled the laminated card down off the wall. He set it between us like it was a hand of cards he didn't want to play. "These rules have been here longer than me," he said. "I didn't write them. Guy who trained me didn't write them either, near as I could tell. I don't know who did. But every person who's worked this tower has followed them, and every person who's worked this tower is still around to talk about it. That's the only selling point I've got. You follow them, you'll be fine. You don't, I can't promise you anything. I want to write these out exactly the way they were on the card, because I think the exact wording matters. I copied them into my own notebook that first night, and I still have that notebook. Rule 1. If dispatch calls your name 3 times in a row on the radio, do not respond. Wait for the 4th call before keying the mic. Rule 2. If you see a smoke column that does not appear on the daily fire map, log the bearing and distance, but do not radio it in until after sunrise. Rule 3. Log the time of every radio click, meaning the channel opens and closes with no voice, even if it happens many times in one night. Rule 4. Do not sweep or clean the catwalk after dark. Leave it until first light, no matter how it looks. Rule 5. If a hiker or visitor reaches the tower after dark and asks to use the radio, tell them the radio is broken. Do not let them touch it. Rule 6. If the wind drops to nothing, completely still, no movement in the trees below, turn off every light inside the cab immediately, including the radio's backlight, and do not turn them back on until the wind returns. Rule 7. Never say your own full name over the radio, for any reason, at any time. I read through them twice. Hollis watched me read them. "Some of these don't make any sense," I said. Not rudely. I was genuinely confused. Rule 4, for instance. Why would I sweep the catwalk at night anyway? And Rule 2, if I see a fire, why would I wait until morning to call it in? That seems backwards from everything you've been telling me about fire response. I know, Hollis said. I know it does. I'm not going to sit here and explain them to you, because I can't, not in a way that'll make sense before you've been up here a while. All I can tell you is, when the situation comes up, and it will, you'll feel like you understand it. You'll feel like you've got a good reason to do the opposite of what the rule says. That feeling is the part you have to fight. What happens if I break one? He was quiet for a second. Different things have happened to different people, from what I've heard. Nothing that showed up the next morning as a body or a blood stain, if that's what you're picturing. It's more like, something gets let in. And it doesn't always show itself right away. Sometimes it takes its time. I laughed again, and again he didn't laugh with me, and this time the silence after it made the back of my neck feel cold, even though the cab was warm from the stove. You'll be fine, he said again, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Just read them again before bed. And again in the morning. Until they're just there, in the back of your head, without you having to think about them. He left around 8 that night, climbing down the 84th stairs with a flashlight, and I watched his truck's headlights bump down the access road until they disappeared around the bend. Then it was just me, the cab, the dark trees stretching out in every direction below the windows, and the radio. The first few nights were boring, in the specific way that night shifts are boring, long stretches of nothing punctuated by small tasks. Every hour on the hour, I did a weather observation, wind speed and direction, temperature, relative humidity, cloud cover. I wrote it in the logbook. Every 2 hours I did a full sweep of the horizon with the binoculars, looking for any glow or smoke column, even though at night you're mostly looking for the orange flicker of a new fire rather than smoke. Dispatch called in around 10 each night. A woman named Renee with a flat, professional voice, just to confirm I was awake and the tower was staffed. Lower saddle, radio check. I'd respond. Lower saddle copies, all quiet. And that was it until morning. On my third night, around 1 a.m., I heard the radio click. I want to describe this carefully, because it's the kind of thing that's hard to explain if you've never used an old two-way radio system. When someone keys their mic and then releases it without saying anything, or sometimes just brushes the button by accident, the radio on the receiving end makes a small sound. A click, sometimes with a tiny bit of static, like a breath of static, and then nothing. It happens all the time on any radio network. Somebody's mic gets bumped in a truck, somebody starts to talk and changes their mind, whatever. So when I heard it that first time, I didn't think anything of it. I glanced at the radio, saw the little light flicker, and went back to my book. Then it happened again. About 4 minutes later. I looked at Rule 3. Log the time of every radio click, even if it happens many times in one night. I wrote it down. 1:04 a.m., click, no voice. Then 1:08. Then 1:09. Then nothing for almost 40 minutes, and then 3 in a row, fast, almost like Morse code, at 1:51. I told myself it was just a glitch. Old equipment, mountain weather, lightning miles away doing something to the antenna. There are 100 boring reasons a radio might click on its own. I'd worked with old electronics my whole life. This kind of thing happens. That would have made sense, except the click stopped exactly at 2 a.m., and didn't start again for the rest of the night, and didn't happen again the next night, or the night after that, and when they came back, almost 2 weeks later, they came back at exactly 1:04 a.m. again. Same minute. I didn't notice that pattern until much later, when I went back through my logbook and lined the dates up side by side. At the time, it was just something I wrote down because the rule told me to, and then forgot about. I didn't mention it to anyone. About 10 days in, I had my first real test of the rules, and it was Rule 2. It was a clear night, no moon, the kind of dark where the stars come down almost to the tree line because there's no light pollution for 80 miles in any direction. Around 11:40 p.m., during my horizon sweep, I caught a faint orange glow to the northeast, low against the ridgeline, maybe 6 or 7 miles out. My training kicked in immediately. I grabbed the firefinder, lined up the sight on the glow, read the bearing, 47 degrees, and went to cross-reference it against the daily fire map Hollis had left taped to the wall, which showed every known fire, prescribed burn, and active incident in the district. There was nothing at 47 degrees. Nothing within 15 miles in that direction at all. The nearest marked fire was a prescribed burn almost 40 miles south, nowhere close to the bearing. This is exactly the kind of thing a lookout exists to catch. A new ignition, something nobody knows about yet. Every instinct I had, every hour of training, told me to radio it in immediately. That's the job. That's the only reason the job exists. I had the handset in my hand. I'd already keyed the mic once, said, "Dispatch, lower saddle," and then I remembered Rule 2. Log the bearing and distance, but do not radio it in until after sunrise. I let go of the mic. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, watching that glow through the binoculars, feeling like I was failing at the one job I had. A real fire, at night, in dry timber, can grow enormously in just a few hours. Waiting until sunrise on a genuine ignition could mean the difference between a small contained burn and something that takes out a whole drainage. I told myself the rule didn't apply here. This was clearly the exact scenario the job existed for. Surely the rule meant something else. Maybe it meant don't report vague smoke during the day when visibility is bad, or don't report something you're not sure about. This was different. This was a glow, at night, with a clear bearing, nothing on the map. I picked up the handset again. And then, and I want to be honest, I don't fully know why I did this. I lowered the binoculars and looked at the glow with just my eyes, no magnification, the way you'd look at something far away normally. It wasn't 6 or 7 miles out anymore. It was close. Like close. Like it was in the trees just below the tower, maybe a quarter mile down the slope, a soft orange light flickering between the trunks the way a campfire flickers, except there was no smoke smell, no crackle, nothing. I logged the bearing and distance as instructed, 47 degrees, originally estimated at 6 to 7 miles, and I did not pick up the radio again. I sat with the lights off for the rest of that hour, which isn't part of any rule, that was just me. The glow stayed there, flickering, until almost 3 a.m., and then it was gone, all at once, the way a light goes out when you flip a switch, not the way a fire dies down. At sunrise, I did exactly what the rule said. I radioed dispatch and reported it as a possible nighttime glow at bearing 47, estimated distance 6 to 7 miles. Requesting daytime confirmation. Renee, dispatch, said she'd have the duty officer take a look with binoculars from the road and get back to me. She got back to me about an hour later. There was nothing there. No burn scar, no smoke, no heat signature on the infrared flyover that happened to be scheduled for that area that week. Nothing at bearing 47 for 15 miles except unburned old-growth forest. Probably just a reflection off something, Renee said. Happens sometimes. Good catch logging it anyway. I said something agreeable and signed off. I didn't mention the part about it being close. I didn't mention that I'd looked at it without the binoculars. I told myself that detail wasn't relevant, that it was a trick of distance perception, that things look closer or farther depending on what you're comparing them to, that there was nothing to explain because nothing had actually happened. That would have been easier to believe if, 2 nights later, I hadn't found a patch of grass on the slope just below the tower, about 100 feet down, burned in a perfect circle maybe 8 feet across, burned down to bare dirt, old ash, clearly not fresh, like it had happened weeks or months ago, except Hollis told me, when I asked him about it during shift change, that there'd never been a fire on that slope. Not in the 11 years he'd worked the tower. He came up and looked at it himself and stood there for a long moment with his hands on his hips, and then he said, "Well, that's new," in a voice that made it clear he didn't think it was new at all. I want to slow down here, because I think it's important to understand that most of my time up there wasn't like this. The vast majority of every night was completely, almost suffocatingly normal. I did weather observations. I read books. I went through probably 30 paperbacks that season, the kind of beat-up mysteries and westerns that get left behind in places like that. I ate canned soup and crackers. I wrote letters to my sister that I'd mail whenever I drove into town for supplies, which was about once a week. Hollis and I would overlap for about 30 minutes at shift change, every evening around 7:30, and he'd tell me about his day, what he'd seen, whether any hikers had come up to look at the view, whether the access road needed grading. He never brought up the rules again after that first night, and I didn't either, mostly. It became part of the background of the job, like checking the propane level or making sure the fire extinguisher was charged. After the smoke incident, things were quiet for almost 3 weeks. The radio clicked sometimes. I kept logging it, like the rules said, though I started to feel a little silly doing it, writing down. Click, no voice. 11, 12 times some nights, like I was tracking something that mattered. I noticed the pattern in the clicks before anything else happened. I was bored one slow afternoon. I'd started staying up a little in the early evening before my shift technically started, just reading in the cab while there was still light, and I pulled out my logbook and started flipping back through it, just killing time. And I noticed that the clicks always happened in clusters, and the clusters always happened on nights with a new moon, or close to it. I went and checked a little lunar calendar that was tacked up near the weather instruments. Old thing, probably from whoever worked the tower a decade ago, and sure enough, every cluster of clicks lined up with the 3 or 4 darkest nights of each month. I thought about mentioning it to Hollis. I didn't. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe something about atmospheric conditions on clear, dark nights affected the radio equipment. That was a real possible explanation. I held on to it. About 5 weeks in, I had the second real test. It was a Tuesday night in early September, the air already carrying that first cold edge that tells you fall is coming even though the days are still warm. Around 9:40 p.m., I heard footsteps on the stairs. This wasn't unheard of. Sometimes hikers who'd misjudged their daylight would end up at the tower after dark, and the protocol was to let them warm up for a few minutes, give them directions back to the trailhead or to the access road, and send them on their way. It happened maybe once a month. I dealt with it twice already that season without incident. I opened the door before they reached the top, the way you're supposed to, so they could see the light and know someone was there. A man came up the last few steps, maybe 60, gray beard, decent hiking gear, a headlamp pushed up on his forehead. He looked tired but not in distress. He introduced himself, said his name was Daryl, said he'd lost the trail coming down from the ridge and his phone had died. I let him in, gave him water, showed him on the map where the trailhead parking was, about 2 miles, mostly downhill, easy enough even in the dark if he was careful. He thanked me, sat for a few minutes to catch his breath, and then he said, "Hey, would you mind if I use your radio? Just to let my wife know I'm okay. She's probably worried sick. My phone's been dead since this afternoon." It was such a normal, reasonable request. The man seemed completely ordinary. Tired, a little embarrassed about getting lost, worried about his wife. Every part of me wanted to help him. Rule 5 came back to me before I'd even finished processing the question. If a hiker or visitor reaches the tower after dark and asks to use the radio, tell them the radio is broken. Do not let them touch it. "I'm sorry," I said. "The radio's actually broken. It's been down for a couple days. I've been using a satellite phone for check-ins, and that's not really set up for personal calls." I felt terrible saying it. It felt cruel, honestly, lying to a tired man about his wife's peace of mind over something that seemed so harmless. Daryl's face did something strange, just for a second. It was so quick I almost missed it, a kind of flatness, like his expression just switched off and back on. Then he smiled and said, "No worries, I understand. I'll get going then before it gets too late." He left a few minutes later. I watched his headlamp bob down the trail through the binoculars until it disappeared into the trees, heading in the direction I told him. About 40 minutes later, the radio clicked. Just once. I logged it, like always, 10:34 p.m., click, no voice, and went back to my book. Then, at 10:52, the radio clicked again, except this time, right after the click, I heard a voice. Very faint, barely audible, like it was coming from far away or through a bad connection. It said, "Thanks for the directions." I sat completely still. The radio doesn't work that way. You can't transmit on it unless you're keying the mic on a unit that's part of the network, and the only units in range were mine, dispatch's base station, and the duty trucks. There was no way for someone on foot, without a radio, to transmit anything. I didn't respond. I didn't write anything in the log for almost 10 minutes, just sat there with my hand near the radio, not touching it. The next morning, at shift change, I asked Hollis, carefully, whether anyone had called an overnight reporting a hiker reaching the trailhead late. I said I'd help the guy named Daryl find his way down, and just wanted to make sure he made it okay. Hollis got very quiet. He asked me to describe the man. I did, the gray beard, the headlamp, the gear, his age, roughly. There's no trailhead access from the direction you sent him, Hollis said slowly. Not for 2 miles. Not even close. The only way down from up here on foot is the service road, and that goes the other direction entirely. I gave him the directions off the map, I said. The laminated one, the one that's been on the wall since. I know the map, Hollis said. I drew half of it. There's no trail where you're describing. There's never been a trail there. It's a cliff face. I want to be honest. I never went looking for Daryl. I never asked dispatch to check trailhead logs, never reported a missing hiker, never did any of the things a responsible person probably should have done. Part of it was that I genuinely didn't know what I would even be reporting. Part of it, I think, was that some part of me already understood, even if I couldn't have said it out loud yet, that there was nothing to find. That whatever had come up those stairs that night hadn't needed directions at all. It had just wanted me to give them. I didn't mention it to anyone else after that conversation with Hollis. He didn't bring it up again either, but for the rest of that week, he stayed at shift change a little longer than usual, sometimes as much as an hour, and a couple of times I caught him looking at me in a way that felt like he was checking on something, making sure I was still all right. Or maybe making sure I was still entirely myself. Rule 4 came up about 6 weeks in, and it's the one that scared me the most, even though, or maybe because, almost nothing happened. It was a windy night, branches scraping somewhere below, the whole tower creaking faintly the way it always did when the gusts came through. Around midnight, during a horizon sweep, I noticed something on the catwalk. The narrow walkway that runs around the outside of the cab, accessible through a door on the south side. There was a scattering of pine needles and small debris across the catwalk decking, which wasn't unusual on a windy night. But there was also a section, maybe 4 feet long, near the northeast corner, that was completely clear. Swept clean. A sharp, clean line between the debris-covered decking and the bare, swept section, like someone had taken a broom to it. I hadn't swept it. Hollis definitely hadn't. He'd left hours before dark, and besides, that wasn't part of the routine. I stood at the window looking at that clean section for a long time. It bothered me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. There was something deeply wrong about a precise, clean-edged rectangle of order in the middle of all that wind-blown chaos. It looked deliberate. It looked tidy in a way that nothing in nature is tidy. My hand was on the catwalk door before I really decided to open it. I told myself I just wanted to look closer, maybe take a photo for the logbook, maybe figure out what could have caused a pattern like that. A downdraft off the roof, maybe, some kind of consistent airflow that swept debris away from that one section. There were explanations. I wanted one of them to be true. Rule 4 surfaced in my mind the way it always did, not as a dramatic warning, just as a flat statement, like a fact I already knew. Do not sweep or clean the catwalk after dark. Leave it until first light, no matter how it looks. I took my hand off the door. I went back to the table and sat down, and I tried to read, and I couldn't focus on a single sentence. Every few minutes I'd glance over at that window, and every time, the clean section looked a little different. Not bigger, the same size, the same sharp edges, but in a different spot. It moved. Slowly. Over the course of about 2 hours, that clean rectangle traveled along the catwalk, all the way around the south side, staying the same size and shape the entire time, like something invisible was being dragged along the decking, in a slow, steady loop, around and around the cab. At 2:17 a.m., and I noticed the time specifically, because of something I'll get to, the clean section stopped moving. It came to rest directly outside the door I'd almost opened, the door on the south side, and it stayed there. It stayed there until first light. I watched it, on and off, for almost 5 hours. At one point I fell asleep sitting up for maybe 20 minutes, and when I woke, my first thought, before I'd even opened my eyes all the way, was that I should check if the clean section had moved, and I remember feeling a flash of something close to panic at the idea that it might be gone, that I might have missed something. It hadn't moved. It was still there, right outside the door, when the sky started to lighten. At first light, exactly as the rule allowed, I opened the catwalk door and stepped out. The clean section was gone, or rather, the whole catwalk was covered in the same scattering of debris now, evenly, no clean spots anywhere. I swept the whole thing, like I did every morning, and it took about 10 minutes, and there was nothing unusual about any of it. Except for one thing. Right at the spot where the clean section had stopped, right outside that door, there was a single handprint pressed into the thin layer of frost that had formed on the railing overnight. A full handprint, fingers spread, like someone had gripped the rail from the outside, leaning in toward the cab. The railing is on the outer edge of the catwalk. There is nothing past it but a 3-foot drop to a steel mesh safety grate, and then 80 feet of open air below that. I photographed it on my phone, even though I had no signal to send it anywhere. I still have the photo. I've shown it to exactly one person since then, and I'll get to that. I noticed, going back over my log afterward, that 2:17 a.m., the time the clean section had stopped moving, was the exact time, the rules said, that I should pay attention to. If the clock stops at 2:17 a.m., do not leave your post. Except that wasn't one of my 7 rules. There were only 7, and I'd memorized all of them. I went back to the laminated card on the wall, just to be sure, and read through all 7 again. Rule 4 was the catwalk rule. There was nothing about a clock stopping at 2:17. But I remembered that line. I remembered it clearly, in the cadence and phrasing of the other rules. If the clock stops at 2:17 a.m., do not leave your post, and I couldn't explain where I'd gotten it from, except that it felt like something I'd always known, the way you know your own phone number without ever having memorized it on purpose. I didn't mention any of this to Hollis. By this point, I think I'd started keeping things from him not because I didn't trust him, but because I was starting to be afraid that talking about these things out loud made them more real, gave them more of a foothold. I know that doesn't make logical sense. It felt true anyway. The 7th week is when things became personal, and I want to be careful about how I describe this part, because it's the part that's hardest for me to talk about, even now. It was my ex-wife's voice. I want to be very clear. There is no possible way my ex-wife's voice could have come through that radio. She didn't know where I worked. We hadn't spoken in over a year. The radio network was a closed system. Dispatch, the duty trucks, and my unit, nothing else, no civilian frequencies crossing over. Hollis had explained all of this to me in detail during training. But it was her voice. Not words exactly, more like a fragment, a half-second of a sentence, the kind of thing you'd hear if someone bumped a recording and it played for an instant before stopping. It said my name. My first name, just my first name, in the exact tone she used to use when she was annoyed with me, that specific, clipped way she'd say it when I'd left dishes in the sink or forgotten to call my mother back. Then it cut off, and the radio was silent. I sat there gripping the edge of the table. My first instinct, and I'm not proud of this, but I think it's important to be honest, was relief. Genuine relief, for just a second, like some part of my brain heard that voice and thought, oh good, she's calling. That's how convincing it was. It didn't sound like an imitation. It sounded like her. Then the radio clicked again, twice this time, fast, and I remembered Rule 1. If dispatch calls your name 3 times in a row on the radio, do not respond. Wait for the 4th call before keying the mic. That wasn't quite what was happening. This wasn't dispatch, and it wasn't calling my name in the structured way the rule described. But the rule came back to me anyway, the way Rule 4 had come back to me on the catwalk, like a reflex. I counted. The first fragment had been 1. The 2 clicks were 2 and 3. I waited. About 30 seconds later, the radio clicked a 4th time, and this time a voice came through clearly. Renee's voice, completely normal, completely flat, doing her routine check-in a little early. Lower saddle, radio check, you copy? I keyed the mic. My hand was shaking. Lower saddle copies, all quiet, I said, and my voice sounded almost normal, which surprised me. You sound a little off, lower saddle. Everything okay up there? Yeah, I said. Yeah, just tired. Long week. Copy that. Get some rest when you can. That would have made sense, except that 2 nights later, it happened again, except this time it wasn't my ex-wife's voice. It was my mother's. She passed away when I was 26. The fragment was even shorter this time, less than a word, really, just a tone, an inflection, but it was unmistakably her, and it came with the same pattern, 1 fragment, then 2 quick clicks, then a 30-second pause, then Renee's normal check-in as the 4th. I started keeping a tally in the margin of my logbook. By the end of that week, it had used 4 different voices. My ex-wife. My mother. An old friend from college I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. And on the 4th occasion, a voice I didn't recognize at all. A man's voice, low, unhurried, that said something I couldn't make out except for 1 word, clearly, at the end. The word was my last name. Just my last name. Not my first name. My last name, the one almost nobody up there had any reason to know, since the radio logs and dispatch only ever used my first name or my call sign. Lower saddle. I'd never said my last name over the radio. Not once. Not to Renee, not to Hollis over the radio, not to anyone. I checked my employment file later, after the season ended, just to satisfy my own curiosity about how something might have learned it. My full legal name was on the file, obviously, on my contract, my tax forms, everything. But none of that was anywhere near the tower. It was all in an office 3 hours away. After the voices started, I expected something to feel different the next morning, at shift change. I think some part of me wanted Hollis to notice something was wrong, the way he had after the hiker, wanted him to ask, wanted an excuse to tell someone. He didn't. He came up the stairs at 7:30, same as always, talked about a deer he'd seen near the trailhead, mentioned the access road had a new pothole forming near the second switchback, asked if I needed anything from town. Completely normal. I almost said something. I got as far as opening my mouth, and then I didn't, because I genuinely could not figure out how to start the sentence in a way that wouldn't sound insane. I went down to the trailer that morning and tried to sleep, the way I did every morning, and I couldn't. I kept thinking about the voices, replaying them, and the more I replayed them the less sure I became that I'd actually heard what I thought I'd heard. By the afternoon, lying there in the dim trailer with the generator humming outside, I'd half convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that 11 weeks of isolation and bad sleep had finally caught up with me, and that what I'd actually heard was just radio static that my exhausted brain had pattern matched into voices, the way people see faces in wood grain. I went back through my logbook, looking for the entries from those nights. I'd written down the times of the clicks, like always, following Rule 3. But next to the entries where the voices had happened, I'd written nothing. No note, no description, nothing to indicate anything unusual had occurred at all. Just click and a timestamp, identical to 100 other entries. I know I wrote more than that in the moment. I remember writing more than that. But the logbook only showed click. This bothered me more than the voices themselves had, in a way. The voices, at least, I could try to explain away: exhaustion, isolation, suggestion. But the missing log entries meant either I'd never written them at all, and my memory of writing them was false, or I had written them, and something had removed them. Neither option was comforting. I didn't mention any of this to Hollis. By this point I think he knew something was happening. He'd started, very gently, asking me at shift change whether I was sleeping okay, whether I wanted him to take an extra night so I could rest. I always said I was fine. I think we were both, in our own ways, avoiding a conversation that we both knew was coming eventually. It was during the 10th week that I finally understood what Rule 7 was actually for, and it changed how I understood everything else. Never say your own full name over the radio, for any reason, at any time. I'd always assumed this rule was about identity, about not giving it, whatever it was, a way to call you, the way a name might be used to summon something or mark you as a target. That's the kind of logic that runs through a lot of folklore. Don't speak your name, don't answer to it, don't let something that wants you have that handle to grab onto. But that wasn't it. Or it wasn't only that. It happened on a night in late September, cold enough that frost had started forming on the inside of the lower windows by 4 a.m. The wind had been steady all night, important, because of Rule 6, and around 3 a.m., it stopped. All at once. One moment the trees below were moving, the cab was creaking faintly the way it always did in wind, and the next moment, total stillness. No sound at all. Not even the small electrical hum of the radio, which I only noticed was gone because of how loud its absence was. Rule 6. If the wind drops to nothing, turn off every light inside the cab immediately, including the radio's backlight, and do not turn them back on until the wind returns. I'd done this once before, a few weeks earlier, during a similarly still night, and nothing had happened. I'd sat in the dark for about 20 minutes until the wind picked back up, feeling foolish and cold, and then turned the lights back on and gone back to my book. That time, I'd almost started to think the rule was one of the more harmless ones, maybe even unnecessary. This time was different. I turned off the lights, including the radio backlight, as fast as I could. My hands knew the switches without needing to look anymore. The cab went completely dark and completely silent. I sat on the edge of the cot, knees against the table, waiting. After a few minutes, the radio clicked. In the dark, with no backlight, I couldn't see the indicator, but I heard it, that small, familiar sound click, and then a held silence, the kind of silence that has a texture to it, like someone is on the other end, breathing, deciding what to say. Then a voice came through. My own voice. Not a fragment this time. Not a half second of inflection. A full sentence, in my own voice, clear as anything, coming out of the radio speaker in the dark. It said, "Lower saddle, radio check, this is," and then it said my full name. First and last. The name I'd never said over that radio, not once, in 10 weeks. And then it waited. I understood, sitting there in the dark, exactly what was happening, and exactly what Rule 7 had actually been protecting against the entire time. It was never about me saying my name, and somehow summoning something. It was about this, about something, on a night like this, in the dark, using my own voice to say my name for me, completing the transmission, finishing the radio check, and about what would happen if I responded to it. If I keyed my mic in the dark and said, "Lower saddle copies," completing the exchange, confirming the name, confirming that I was Lower Saddle, that the name belonged to me, spoken back in answer to a voice that wasn't mine, using my own identity as the password. I didn't understand what would happen next. I still don't. But every instinct I had told me that answering, completing that radio check in the dark, with my real name already spoken, would be like signing something. Like putting my name on a form I hadn't read. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the mic. I sat there, in the absolute dark and absolute silence, while my own voice, in the radio, said my full name and then waited for a response that didn't come. It said it again. The same sentence, same inflection, exactly identical, like a recording on a loop. Then again. I don't know how many times. I lost count somewhere past a dozen, and I stopped being able to tell whether time was passing normally at all. At some point I realized I'd been silently mouthing along with it, my own lips forming my own name in time with the voice, without meaning to, like a song you can't get out of your head, and I had to physically put my hand over my own mouth to stop. The wind came back at 4:51 a.m. I know because the moment it did, the moment I heard the first stirring of the trees below, the voice stopped, mid-sentence, and the radio clicked off, and the cab's small electrical hum returned, and I could suddenly hear my own breathing again, ragged, like I'd been holding it for most of the past 2 hours. I turned the lights back on. My hands were shaking too badly to write in the logbook for almost 10 minutes. When I finally did write something, I wrote 3:02 to 4:51, wind stopped, lights off per Rule 6. Radio activity during period, multiple clicks, voice. That's all. I couldn't make myself write more than that, even though I knew, the way I'd known about the missing entries before, that even this much might not survive until morning. It didn't. The next evening, before my shift, I checked the logbook out of habit, and that entry, like the others, had been reduced to a single word. Quiet. I want to tell this part exactly the way it happened, without making it more dramatic than it was, because the truth is that the worst moment of that whole season wasn't loud, or violent, or even especially strange looking from the outside. It was small. It was the kind of decision that takes about 2 seconds, and afterward you spend the rest of your life wondering about those 2 seconds. It was my next to last night on the tower. I didn't know that at the time, but the season was ending in a few days regardless. The fall closure date was approaching, and I'd already started thinking about what I'd do afterward, where I'd go, whether I'd come back the following season. I'd more or less decided I wouldn't, though I hadn't said that to anyone yet, not even Hollis. It was quiet, almost aggressively quiet, the kind of quiet that by this point in the season made me more nervous than noise would have. Around 1:50 a.m., the radio clicked, and I logged it automatically, the way I had probably 400 times by then, barely looking up from my book. Then it clicked again, almost immediately, and a voice came through. Renee's voice. Completely normal. Lower Saddle, radio check, you copy? This wasn't unusual on its own. Renee's check-ins came at irregular times sometimes, depending on her workload. I keyed the mic, the way I had every single night for 11 weeks, and said, Lower Saddle copies all, and I stopped. I stopped because of the clock. There's a small battery clock mounted above the firefinder, the kind with a sweeping second hand, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the second hand stop. Not slow down, stop, completely, mid-sweep, frozen at a position I didn't need to check, because I already knew, the way I'd known about Rule 4's hidden edition weeks earlier, that it was 2:17. If the clock stops at 2:17 a.m., do not leave your post. I wasn't leaving my post. I was sitting right there, mic in hand, mid-sentence. But something about seeing that second hand frozen, combined with the radio check coming through at exactly the wrong moment, made every hair on my arm stand up at once, and I realized, with a kind of clarity that felt like waking up, that I hadn't actually confirmed it was Renee. I'd assumed it was Renee, because it sounded like Renee, because Renee's check-ins were the most normal, most expected sound on that radio, and that was exactly why it would be the easiest voice to use. I had the mic keyed. I'd already said, "Lower saddle copies all." My thumb was still on the button. The next word, the word I'd said roughly 400 times that season without ever once thinking about it, was quiet. I didn't say it. I let go of the mic, mid-word, mid-transmission, and the radio went silent, not the click of a normal release, just silence, like the connection had simply ended. I sat there, not moving, for what felt like a very long time. The second hand on the clock was still frozen at 2:17. The cab was completely silent. Outside, nothing moved, no wind, no sound from the trees, nothing. After what my own watch told me was almost 11 minutes, though it had felt like much longer, the second hand on the wall clock jumped forward, all at once, catching up to where it should have been, like a video skipping ahead to sync back to real time. The wind returned at the same moment, all at once, exactly the way it had stopped on the night with Rule 6. The radio clicked once more, and Renee's voice came through, and this time, I think, it really was Renee, though I have no way to prove that and never will. "Lower saddle, you still there? Lost you for a second." I keyed the mic. My hand was steady, which surprised me. "Lower saddle copies," I said. "All quiet." I said the word. I said, "Quiet." But I said it as a complete response, on my own terms, after the moment had passed, not as the second half of a sentence I'd started before I understood what I was answering. I don't know if that distinction matters. I've thought about it more than almost anything else from that whole season, and I still don't know. "Copy that," Renee said. "Long night?" "Yeah," I said. "Long night." My contract ended 4 days later. The fall closure came on schedule. Hollis and I did the shutdown procedures together, draining the water lines, boarding the lower windows, locking down the cab, and he drove me down to where my truck was parked at the base of the access road. Before I left, I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he'd ever had a night where the clock stopped at 2:17. "What happened?" "Nothing right away," he said. "Took about 6 months. My wife left, not because of anything dramatic, she just stopped recognizing parts of me, she said. Started saying I sounded different sometimes. On the phone mostly. She said sometimes I'd call and it wouldn't sound like me, just for a second, and then it would, and she figured she was imagining it, until she didn't anymore." He didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't ask. We shook hands, and I drove home, and that was the end of it. I didn't go back the next season. I told the district office I'd taken a job somewhere else, which wasn't true at the time but became true a few weeks later, when I found work doing maintenance at a state park a few hours from where I grew up. Daytime only, plenty of people around, cell signal, the whole thing. I think about the tower sometimes. I think about Hollis, who's probably retired by now, or close to it. I think about the handprint in the frost, and the photo I still have of it on my phone, which I showed once to my sister, who looked at it for a long time and then asked, very quietly, whose hand it was, and I didn't have an answer for her, because the only thing I could say, the only thing that felt true, was that it was the right size to be mine. I check my phone sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep. Not for anything in particular. Just I check it. And a few months ago, around 2 in the morning, doing exactly that, I had a missed call. No caller ID. No voicemail. Just a missed call, timestamp 2:17 a.m. I haven't called the number back. I don't think I'm going to. But I still have the number saved in my phone, under a contact I didn't create, with a name I didn't type in, and the name is mine.